What if Dan Hibiki embraced Satsui no Hado?
Chapter 1. The Master of Nothing. Dan Hibiki, the self-proclaimed master of Saikyo, had always been a punchline. His pink gi, his over-the-top taunts, and his notoriously weak Hadoken, the Gadoken, a pathetic puff of pink energy that fizzled out a few feet from his palm, were all testament to his glorious incompetence. He was a man defined by a singular, obsessive purpose, avenging his father, Gouhadouken, who had been killed by the Muay Thai emperor Sagat. But beneath the bravado and the ceaseless self-aggrandizing lay a wellspring of profound, crippling frustration. He had trained his whole life, clinging to a bastardized martial art, a style he'd cobbled together from the scraps of his father's teaching and his own flawed technique. He'd sought out Gadoken, the legendary master, who had also trained his rival, Ryu, but had been turned away, his heart consumed by a vengeful fire that Gadoken could never sanction. Dan was left with only his pride and his father's memory, two things he polished obsessively, but that offered him no true power. One night, after a particularly humiliating defeat at the hands of a street brawler, Dan found himself staring at his reflection in a grimy alley puddle. The face staring back at him was not a heroic one. It was a mask of simmering rage, of a desperate, hollow man. His fists clenched, the knuckles turning white. His father's face, scarred and defeated, swam before his eyes. He had failed him. Again. The Gadoken, that miserable whisper of a power, was all he had to show for his years of effort. A dark, insidious thought, one he had always suppressed, began to surface. It was the whisper of a different path, a different power, a path Ryu and Ken had danced around their entire lives, one they had been taught to fear, the Hadou. The true Hadou was a force of pure destructive intent, a power born from the absolute desire to dominate and destroy. It was the path of Akuma, the demon who had embraced the Satsui No Hado, the killing intent. Dan had always dismissed it as a boogeyman, an evil for others to fight. But now, in the depths of his despair, it felt like the only answer. His quest for revenge against Sagat was a fire that burned brighter than any moral code. If this power could grant him the strength to finally avenge his father, what was the cost? What was a soul, weighed against a lifetime of failure and ridicule? The question, once unthinkable, now felt like a desperate plea for salvation. He sought it out, not through a master, but through the bitterest, most dangerous training of his life. He retreated into the secluded mountains of Japan, a place of silent austerity and biting winds. He pushed his body and mind to their absolute limits, ignoring the pain and focusing solely on his rage. He didn't try to replicate Gadoken's techniques or Ryu's balanced philosophy. He tapped directly into his hatred for Sagat, for the world that had mocked him, for his own weakness. He channeled his anger, his humiliation, and his singular desire for vengeance into a raw, unfiltered energy. He forced it to coalesce into a Hadoken, not a pathetic puff, but a searing, incandescent blast of pure, dark emotion. The first time it worked, a crimson and black orb of energy exploded from his palm, vaporizing a boulder and leaving a scorch mark in the dirt. It wasn't the Gadoken. It wasn't even the Hadoken. It was a new, terrible power, an echo of the Satsui No Hado twisted by his own, unique blend of malice and inadequacy. He named it the Gouhadouken, the Fierce Hadoken. He felt the raw power course through his veins, the sensation a terrifying, addictive thrill. It was a power born of his weakness, a mirror reflecting his soul's deepest flaws. He was no longer the master of nothing. He was the master of rage. Word of his newfound strength began to spread through the underground fighting circuit. The jokes about him disappeared, replaced by whispers of a new, dangerous force. Fighters who had once laughed at his taunts now found themselves on the receiving end of a devastating new arsenal. The Gadoken was gone, replaced by a swift, crushing version of the Hadoken. His Shoryuken, once a pathetic leap, now launched opponents into the air with explosive force. His iconic taunt, once a show of vanity, now came with an unhinged predatory snarl that promised pain. Dan was no longer a clown. He was a coiled viper, his pink G a stark, ironic contrast to the darkness that now lived inside him. The world he had wanted so desperately to impress now recoiled in fear, and for the first time in his life, Dan felt truly powerful. He felt respected. He felt seen, and that feeling, more than the power itself, was what sealed his fate. He was ready to face Sagat, and he would not be denied his revenge. Chapter 2. The Tiger's Fall. The air in the arena was thick with anticipation. The crowd, a mix of curious onlookers and hardcore fight fans, had gathered to watch the rumored rematch between the disgraced king, Sagat, and the self-proclaimed hero, Dan Hibiki. For years, Sagat had carried the weight of his past victories and the burden of his singular defeat at the hands of Dan's father, a fact that had haunted him and driven his own search for redemption. He had been a king, a god of Muay Thai, and now he was a shadow of his former self, a man who sought to atone for a moment of rage that had cost a good man his life. Sagat saw Dan not as a true rival, but as a pitiful reminder of his own monstrous past. He knew the pain of a son's grief, and he had hoped that by refusing to fight Dan seriously, he could finally put the matter to rest. But the man who stepped into the ring that day was not the clown he remembered. Dan's face was a stone mask, devoid of his usual cocky grin. His eyes burned with an unsettling pinkish glow, and the aura around him felt wrong. Sagat had faced killers before, men who wielded the power of the Satsui No Hado. But this was different. This wasn't the cold, surgical hate of Akuma, or the tormented, conflicted darkness of Ryu. This was a messy, furious, almost pathetic hate, a pure, distilled poison born from years of failure and humiliation. It was a power that disgusted Sagat, and yet he could feel its raw, unbridled force. The fight began. Sagat, relying on his formidable tiger shots and tiger uppercuts, initially held the upper hand. But Dan was impossibly fast, his movements a blur of pink and black. He parried Sagat's attacks with a new brutal efficiency, each strike imbued with a vicious, cutting energy. Sagat's jaw dropped as Dan unleashed a new kind of projectile, a dense crimson orb of power that exploded on impact, sending Sagat stumbling backward. It was a Gouhadouken, and it was 1,000 times more powerful than the pitiful puff of air Sagat remembered. "You're not a hero, boy," Sagat grunted, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. "You're a monster." Dan didn't respond. He simply closed the distance, his fists wrapped in crackling dark energy. He moved with a speed and ferocity that shocked the crowd, a fluid, beautiful violence that contrasted grotesquely with his absurd appearance. He cornered Sagat against the ropes, a flurry of strikes that left the former champion dazed and battered. Sagat could not land a single clean hit. His wisdom, his years of experience, were useless against this unhinged, all-consuming rage. The Tiger Emperor, a man who had faced down gods of fighting, was being dismantled by a man he had once dismissed as a joke. "This is for my father," Dan growled, his voice a distorted, guttural thing. He reared back, charging a final devastating blow. The energy pulsed around him, so bright and hot it made the air shimmer. Sagat, defeated but not broken, looked up into the eyes of his opponent. He saw no triumph there, no satisfaction, only a hollow, desperate rage. He saw the face of a man who had sold his soul for a moment of vengeance. "You can never win," Sagat said, a sorrowful note in his voice. "This power, it will consume you." Dan ignored him. He unleashed the final blow, a flaming crimson uppercut that was a mockery of a true Shoryuken. It slammed into Sagat's chest with the force of a wrecking ball, the energy detonating on impact. Sagat flew backward, a broken doll, and landed in a crumpled heap at the edge of the ring. He was not dead, but he was broken, his will to fight completely shattered. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a stunned, disbelieving silence. They had come to see a fight, and they had witnessed an execution. Dan stood in the center of the ring, his chest heaving, his body pulsing with the leftover energy. The victory he had craved his entire life felt empty. He had finally avenged his father. He had defeated the man who had wronged them. But there was no joy in the victory, only a profound, suffocating emptiness. The dark energy, having fulfilled its purpose, now lingered, an insidious presence that gnawed at his core. He had a brief, fleeting moment of clarity, a flash of self-awareness where he saw the monster he had become. But it was quickly drowned out by the whisper of the Hadou, a promise of even greater power, a lure that preyed on his newfound addiction to being feared. The path of revenge had ended. The path to power had just begun. Chapter 3: The Shadow of Saikyo. News of Sagat's brutal, one-sided defeat spread like wildfire through the global fighting community. The name Dan Hibiki, once a punchline, was now spoken with a chilling mixture of awe and fear. Rumors of his monstrous new power, his Gouhadouken, captivated the world. But for those who knew him best, the victory was not a cause for celebration. It was a blaring crimson warning sign. Sakura, Dan's former student, was among the first to see the truth. She had always admired Dan for his perseverance and his relentless, if misguided, spirit. But when she saw the video of the fight, a cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. His movements, once chaotic and clumsy, were now a terrifying, almost predatory dance. His eyes, in a close-up shot, held a vacant, ruthless intensity she had never seen before. She sought him out at his dilapidated dojo. The sign was still there, but the building itself felt different, charged with a strange, malevolent energy. She found him sitting alone, staring at a torn, faded photograph of his father. He didn't look up when she entered. "Master Dan," she said, her voice soft, "that was a magnificent victory. You've done it. You've avenged your father." Dan didn't move. "It's over," he said, his voice flat. "The revenge, it's done. And it means nothing." Sakura's heart ached for him. She knew this was the moment of truth for so many warriors, the satisfaction of a hard-won victory, a chance to find peace. But Dan was a different kind of man, a man whose ambition had become an open wound. "You have found your peace, haven't you?" she asked. He finally looked at her, and she recoiled. His eyes held that unsettling glowing pink, and the veins in his face seemed to pulse with a faint dark light. "Peace? There is no peace, Sakura. There is only power. I need more. He stood up, the aura around him crackling. This is a weak power. My Hadou is small, but I can make it grow. I can become stronger. I can take what is mine. What do you mean, take what is yours? Sakura asked, a tremor in her voice. Dan smiled, a chilling, joyless expression. The world thinks the Hadou is something you are given, a gift. But it is a resource, a fire, and I am going to become the greatest fire this world has ever seen. His ambitions, once so small and personal, had metastasized. He was no longer a man seeking revenge for his father. He was a man with an insatiable hunger for power. He saw the world not as a place to live, but as a source of energy to be consumed. Sakura, horrified, pleaded with him, "Master Dan, this is not the way. This power is dangerous. It will twist you into a monster." He laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "I was always a joke, Sakura." "A joke? What is more monstrous than that? I am a master now, not of Saikyo, but of my own will. I will not be a joke ever again." He raised his hand, and a small, concentrated orb of dark energy formed in his palm. It was the Gouhadouken in its purest, most deadly form, a sphere of compressed rage. He didn't threaten her with it. He was simply demonstrating the truth of his words. He had found his destiny, not in the light of the Hadou, but in its darkest, most twisted reflection. She saw in him what Gadoken had always feared, the fragile, wounded ego of a man finally given a taste of true power. Sakura left the dojo that day, not with her master's blessing, but with the chilling knowledge that she was now a witness to the birth of a new kind of evil, one whose name was Dan Hibiki. Chapter 4. The Broken God. Ken Masters felt the chill of it first. He was in his secluded dojo in America, teaching a class on the fundamentals of the Hadou, when a prickle of unease ran down his spine. It was a familiar feeling, one that always preceded the rise of a great, malevolent power. But this was different. This wasn't the Satsui No Hado of Akuma. It was something sloppier, more volatile. He saw the news footage of the Sagat fight, and his blood ran cold. He couldn't believe his eyes. The man he and Ryu had dismissed for years, the pathetic, goofy master of the Saikyo style, was now wielding a dark and terrifying version of their own power. "It's a mistake," Ken shouted, pacing the polished wooden floor of his dojo. "He's just an amateur. He doesn't have the control for this." But the reports from the fighting world told a different story. Dan was a force of nature, a pink and black tornado of pure destruction. He wasn't just beating opponents, he was humiliating them. He was using his newfound power to shatter their confidence, to break their spirits. He would taunt them with his absurd signature poses, then unleash a brutal, disproportionate assault, a savage mockery of a true Hadou user. He was fighting not to win, but to inflict a psychological wound, a reflection of the one that had festered inside him for so long. Meanwhile, in a quiet, forested part of Japan, Ryu felt it too. The whisper of the new, corrupted Hadou was a static in his mind, an annoying, buzzing presence that interfered with his own search for inner peace. It was a distorted echo of his own internal battle, and it filled him with a profound sense of sadness. Dan, for all his foolishness, had been a kindred spirit of a sort, a man who had also walked a lonely path in search of strength. Now he had chosen the easy way out. He had embraced the very thing Ryu had spent his life resisting. The two friends, separated by an ocean, knew what they had to do. They had to confront Dan. Ken, consumed by a fierce desire to stop the corruption he saw, booked the fastest flight he could. Ryu, with a quiet resignation, began the long, difficult journey back to the city. They met at a neutral location, a secluded temple in the heart of Japan, a place of spiritual balance that they hoped could quell the volatile energy that now permeated Dan's being. "He's not the same, Ryu," Ken said, his voice grave. "He's a different person, empty. He's a broken god." Ryu nodded, his gaze distant. "He was always broken, Ken. He just never had the power to show it. The Hadou, it doesn't create darkness, it reveals it." They waited. They knew he would come. Dan, drunk on his own legend, was now actively seeking out opponents who he believed were worthy of his talent. He wanted to fight the best, to prove to the world, and more importantly, to himself that he was a true master. He arrived in a whirlwind of pink and black, his aura so potent it made the very stones of the temple vibrate. "The dynamic duo," he sneered, looking at them with a cold, condescending arrogance. "Have you come to see the new master? Or have you come to take your place among the fallen?" Ryu and Ken stood side by side, their fighting stances fluid and ready. This was not a test of skill. This was an exorcism. They would have to fight the man they knew, the man they had laughed at and felt sorry for, a man who was now a prisoner of his own darkest desires. The air crackled, not with the honorable spirit of a duel, but with the chilling, foreboding tension of a tragedy about to unfold. Chapter 5. The Clash of Destinies. The battle that erupted at the temple was not a contest of equals. It was a desperate attempt to save a soul from a bottomless pit of its own making. Ken, fiery and direct, launched his assault first. His flaming shoryuken, a testament to his vibrant spirit, blazed through the air, but it was easily swatted aside by Dan's new, dark power. Dan moved with an unnatural speed, his movements precise and vicious. He wasn't the sloppy brawler they knew. He was an executioner. He met Ken's attack with a flurry of strikes, each one a precise, painful mockery of Ken's own style. He was faster, stronger, and completely unhinged. "You're too sentimental, Ken," Dan sneered, his eyes gleaming with a manic light. "You cling to the old ways. You hold back. I hold back for no one." He unleashed a barrage of Gouhadoukens, not the single-fire Hadokens of his former self, but a rapid-fire torrent of dark energy that sent Ken reeling. The world around them seemed to dim, the light of the sun struggling to break through the veil of malevolent power Dan was radiating. Ryu, meanwhile, fought with a quiet, sorrowful fury. He had always been the one to walk the knife's edge of the Hadou, to fight the darkness within. Now he was seeing what would have become of him, had he not had Gouken's teachings and Ken's friendship to ground him. He could feel the connection between his own power and Dan's, a horrifying, twisted reflection. He was fighting his own potential downfall. He countered Dan's assaults with his trademark patience and precision, weaving and ducking through the energy blasts. "Dan, stop this," Ryu pleaded, his voice heavy with grief. "This power, it is not you. This is not your destiny." Dan laughed, a high, piercing sound. "My destiny? My destiny was to be a joke. My destiny was to be a punchline. This is not my destiny, Ryu. This is my freedom." He raised his hands, gathering all the dark energy he could muster. The air grew still, heavy with a terrible, crushing pressure. A swirling maelstrom of black and crimson energy formed in front of him, a terrible, concentrated vortex of rage and sorrow. It was a new attack, a perverted form of his ultimate move, a technique he called the Saikyo annihilation. It was the distillation of his entire life of suffering, ready to be unleashed upon the men who had always outshone him. You had a master and a friend and all the talent in the world, Dan snarled, his voice a venomous hiss. I had nothing. This is my chance, my only chance, and I will not fail. He launched the attack, a roaring, devastating cone of dark energy. Ryu and Ken, caught in its blast, were thrown backward, their bodies screaming in pain as the violent, unnatural energy seared their flesh. They hit the ground, their bodies bruised and broken. They were defeated. Dan stood over them, a figure of terrible majesty and grotesque tragedy, his pink gi now a symbol of all that was lost. He had done it. He had defeated the two greatest practitioners of the Hadou in the world. He was the master now. But as he stood there, triumphant and alone, a quiet, terrifying truth began to dawn on him. The hunger for power, for vengeance, for recognition. It had not been sated. It was only getting stronger. Chapter 6. The Empty Throne. The defeat of Ryu and Ken sent shockwaves across the globe. News of the battle spread, a chilling testament to Dan's absolute victory. He had not just won, he had broken them, leaving them bruised, defeated, and spiritually drained. The fighting world recoiled in horror and fascination. Dan Hibiki was no longer a joke. He was a tyrant. He returned to his dojo, but it was not the same. It was no longer a place of training and flawed camaraderie. It was a throne room, and he, the defeated clown, was now its king. But the victory was a hollow one. The profound, insatiable hunger that had consumed him gnawed at his core. He had avenged his father. He had defeated his rivals. He was at the top, but he felt no joy, no satisfaction, only a terrible yawning void. The Hadou had given him power, but it had stolen everything else. He found himself wandering through the halls of his dojo, the silence deafening. The portraits of his father, of Sakura, of the few people who had ever truly cared for him, now felt like accusations. He was alone. The power was his, but at what cost? He looked at his hands, the hands that had delivered the final crushing blow to his rivals, and saw not a master's hands, but a monster's. One day, he sought out the one man he had truly feared in the past, the one man whose power was greater than his own, Akuma. He found him on a remote, volcanic island, a place of pure, destructive energy. Dan arrived not to fight, but to kneel, his head bowed. "Master," Dan whispered, "you are the true master of the Hadou. I have followed your path. I have embraced the darkness. I have conquered my enemies, but I feel nothing. Please, tell me, what do I do now?" Akuma, a silent, terrifying force of nature, simply looked at him. There was a faint, condescending smile on his face. Akuma had known this would happen. He had seen the fragile, wounded boy inside the arrogant man. He had seen the immense void that years of failure had created. "You are a fool," Akuma rumbled, his voice a thunderous echo. "You think this is a path to happiness?" The Satsui No Hado is not a tool for a boy's revenge. It is an end in itself. It is the ultimate truth of a world built on death and destruction. You have not embraced the Hadou. The Hadou has consumed you. You are nothing now. He raised his hand, and a single, pure, dark blast of the true Hadou erupted from his palm. It was not a show of force, not an attack. It was a demonstration of the power Dan had so foolishly tried to wield. The force was so immense, so absolute, that Dan felt the meager, tainted power within him shrivel and die. He was on his knees, his face a mask of terror and disbelief, as he felt the essence of his newfound strength being utterly and completely drained from him. He had been a king, and now he was a child. He was nothing. I am nothing, Dan cried, the words torn from his throat. Akuma laughed, a cold, empty sound. Yes, you are a joke once more. He turned and walked away, leaving Dan alone, a broken man in a broken landscape, his pathetic kingdom of rage and power now reduced to a smoking ruin. His Hadou was gone, his power stripped, his ambition a shattered, mocking memory. The man who had once been the master of Saikyo was now the master of nothing. The path to power had not led to glory, but to the most profound, devastating emptiness of all. The only thing that remained of his dark journey was the deep, unhealable wound that now existed in his soul, a scar left by the power he had so foolishly sought. The punchline had returned, but this time there was no one left to laugh.
What If Gaming Stories hopes you've enjoyed this content. Please like, comment, and subscribe to What If Gaming Stories to support our channel. Until next time, keep asking, what if?